Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, I want to start this special Wednesday talk. This is the first Wednesday talk in this seminar, and I'm really happy to welcome all of you. So this first Wednesday talk, we're going to focus on the Hadith. And the second Wednesday talk, we're going to invite another professor who talk about the region and society in Japan. And the third week, me, I'm also, by the way, I have to introduce myself first. My name is Kaiyim Naoki Yamamoto. Now I'm an assistant professor in Ibn Khaldun University, and my specialty is Ottoman Tasawwuf and also the Asian civilization and Islam. And the third week, I also gonna hold a Wednesday talk, and I'm gonna talk about the, Islam and Japan and so on. But this week, we're gonna focus on Hadith. And if you're a Muslim, then I'm sure that everybody knows about Hadith. And Hadith about the record or the memory of the Prophet Muhammad. And by the way, do you have someone who is very important to you, or someone you care about? And if this person is really important to you, I think every single word or every single movement it matters to you. And Hadith is about this. There's one really important person who lived in the Arab Peninsula in 7th century. And this person changed the whole thing in the society in that time. And the people around him, they experienced this change, or they experienced this importance of dynamism. And they saw that they have to keep this memory. They have to keep this experience. And this is how they invented this science, the ilm al-hadith. And this is not special, this is really ordinary thing, and this is so normal, this is really close, as long as you're human beings. And today, we're gonna welcome these two important persons who specialize in ilm al-hadith. The one is our lecturer, Professor Recep Şentürk, and another is my Japanese friend and also mentor from Doshichi University, Professor Moriyama. And Professor Moriyama, he studied about hadith from a historical aspect, and Professor Recep Şentürk, he focused on hadith from the importance of how this tradition is unbroken and still continue in this Muslim society. Okay, so this kind of opening talk from me, and I'm going to let Professor Recep to talk about.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's a great honor and pleasure to be in such a meeting, and in particular in Süleymaniye, because this is the place where they conducted highest level of hadith research until the last century. So it makes me very happy to observe that we are restarting this type of work here. So I will be talking about how the chain of hadith continued for 15 centuries. And this is the reason why I named my presentation as Unbroken Chain of Social Memory, because I believe that Hadith embodies social memory of Muslims, social memory of Islamic civilization, and this social memory has been transmitted from generation to generation continuously through the Hadith transmission network. That's why I use the dates 610 to 2019. So Hadith Transmission Network is the longest recorded social network in the world. So there is no such network recorded in the world. Of course, there are networks, but they are not recorded. So Muslims were very peculiar, very careful in recording this network. Why? Because there is a religious reason for it, and also there is a legal and political reason for it, because the sayings of Prophet Muhammad have religious significance, legal significance, political significance. So we have here with us a network which lasted 1409 years, in solar years, or in Hijra, according to Hijra calendar, 1452 lunar years. And as I said, there is no comparable recorded network in the world today. This system has two dimensions. One is the narratives that are transmitted from generation to generation, and the effort was to make sure that these narratives are not corrupted, not tampered with. They are authentic and reliable narratives. So Muslims developed a methodology to ensure this. It's called ISNAD system, and the discipline of Usul al-Hadith, or the methodology of Hadith, exclusively focuses on the study of ISNAD, and it critically analyzes ISNAD system to ensure that it works properly in such a way that no fake saying is attributed to Prophet Muhammad. They always sift, if there is any false claim that something belong to Prophet Muhammad. And after we made sure that a saying belongs really to Prophet Muhammad, then what we need to do is to understand this saying and put it in practice. So Muslims developed another discipline for this. It's called Usul al-Fiqh. So it's a methodology of understanding the Hadith in a proper way. So these two disciplines, they are peculiar to Islamic civilization. No other civilization in the world has this kind of disciplines, Usul al-Hadith and Usul al-Fiqh. One about the transmission, reliable transmission. The other is appropriate understanding and practicing the Hadith material. In my view, Hadith scholars, they are the most critical-minded scholars in Islamic intellectual history, because they critically analyze the isnad, the chain of transmission, and at the same time they critically interpret the meaning of the hadith before putting it in practice. And to be able to do this, as I mentioned, they innovated many concepts and many methods. So therefore I say that they are the most innovating scholars. So they are innovators, but they fought innovation, but they themselves innovated new concepts and methods. But this innovation is in the service of conserving hadith material, and actually the systems they developed, usul hadith and usul fiqh, may be called as immunization system of Islamic religion, to protect any false idea to enter Islam. And also hadith scholars innovated the ijazah system, the written diploma, the written license, and they innovated the isnad system, transmission of hadith through the chains. So these are all innovations that they contributed. And this system is very dynamic, very fluid, and its structure changed over time. So there is continuity and change in the transmission system, as well as in the interpretation system when we analyze it over time. So I have to go very fast, and I have to be very brief because we have a limited time. Okay, I will continue talking while they are fixing this problem. In my research, which started as a PhD work at Columbia University, it is published as a book by Stanford University Press in English. Afterwards, it's translated to Arabic, Spanish, and also Turkish. That's the Turkish translation. So in this book, I analyzed the history of hadith transmission from 610 to 1505 25 generations from time of Prophet Muhammad until death of Imam Zehebi, and my data sources were Imam Zehebi's book and Imam Suyuti's book. But after that, I wanted to extend it until today. So I used other sources like Kettani's book and other references. I don't want to go into the details of it to construct the network from 610 until 2019. So this is how the network from 610 to 1505, number of scholars who are titled Hafiz. So Hafiz of Hadith means the top layer of scholars. They don't only transmit Hadith but also interpret the Hadith. If somebody only transmits Hadith, he is not a respected scholar because it's considered only the data. If the scholar knows how to interpret, then he is considered a real, true scholar. And this interpretation may have relevance to theology, law, or tasawwuf, the Sufism. So you can see that network grows, and then the number of scholars who are called Hafiz get less and less. So I will explain why the number grew first and then why it decreased after a particular generation. So this shows what happened after 16th century. You can see that in every century there are scholars who are called Hafiz. So this shows the continuity of the network. And in the history of Hadith transmission, we can observe several stages. In the first stage, only the individual narratives were transmitted from one scholar to another scholar. Later, those individual narratives were put together in small hadith collections. Then scholars started transmitting these small collections. After that, larger collections, and after that, collection of the collections, which are called Kütüb-ü Sitte, 6 reliable books. So this expedited the process of transmission from one generation to another generation. Later, institutionalization stage came. We observed a rise of Hadith colleges, Darul Hadith. One of the Darul Hadith exists in Istanbul in Süleymaniye. So opening of Darul Hadith expedited the process. And later, in the 20th century, a study of Hadith was carried on to modern academic setting. In the modern universities, we have Hadith departments where Hadith studies is carried on. So in my research, my question was, is there a structure in this network? Is it a haphazard, unsystematic network, or is there a structure for it? And in order to determine whether there is a structure or not, whether it's a reliable network or not, I had to look at patterns. If there are patterns repeating themselves over time. So if there are patterns, that means there is a structure. If there is no pattern, that means it is not systematic, it's a chaotic network. And so the first thing I looked at the ratio of in-layer connections vis-a-vis out-layer connections. So connections within one particular generation and the connections to outside of this generation. So there is a ratio around 3% of the connections of a particular generation of scholars to the scholars from the same generation, and 97% of the connections to scholars who are outside this generation, so like earlier generations or later generations. So this pattern repeats itself over time, over 26 generations, and this shows that there is a systematic operation in the distribution of network relations. And I also looked at how the connections, teacher and student connections of a particular network is divided to the layers to which one particular generation is connected. So a particular generation of Hadith scholars can be connected to up to 4 generations earlier and up to 4 generations later. So 4 generations of teachers and 4 generations of students maximum. And also there is the generation itself. So in total there is 9 generations, 4 generations earlier and 4 generations later. So and I checked like how these connections are distributed, like what's the percentage of the connections to the same generation, and what's the percentage of connections to earlier and later generations. And I came up with this wave-shaped graph. So this wave-shaped graph shows the distribution of connections in layer 9. So is this peculiar only to layer 9, or this pattern repeats itself in every generation? Okay, so this graph shows that this pattern repeats itself in every generation, 25 generations. So this demonstrates that there is a system here and there are repeating patterns. And even the scholars who were involved in this network, they did not know they were creating such a pattern, and they could not plan, you know, something like this over like 1,000 years. They cannot like come together and say, okay, let's make 30% of our connections to our own generation, and then 20% to one generation earlier, 20% to one generation later. So this wave-shaped graph shows that they had minimum connections within the same generation, and then connections mostly focused on 2 generations earlier and 2 generations later. And there is a reason for this, because Hadith scholars, they try to reduce number of connections in their transmission chain. So that's why they try to reach earliest possible generation and transmit the Hadith to latest possible generation. And when you look at the geographic dimension of the network, you can see that in layer 1, most of the scholars, they were in Medina, but in the second layer, like from layer 2 to 4, most of the scholars, they were in Damascus, and from layer 5 to 7, you see that most of the scholars, they were like distributed in Basra, Kufa, Damascus, and also Baghdad, Wasit, and you see the Central Asia also rising. So there isn't a single center in Islamic scholarship. So this is what I call polycentric civilization. And so this is the distribution in the 20th century. You see India had highest number of Hadith scholars, and Damascus, and Morocco, and Hijaz. But you see in Turkey, there was only one scholar who is considered a hafiz of hadith, like at the top level. And I told you that hadith scholars, they are like very critical minded, and perhaps the most critical minded. So I will give you just a glimpse how they critically analyzed the transmission chain of narratives. So I came up with 7 principles summarizing usul al-hadith. So the first one is about the length of the chain. So the shorter the chain, the more reliable the information. And number of chains through which hadith is narrated, the more parallel chains are there, the more reliable hadith is. There's another method. And also the more continuous the chain is, the more reliable it is. And the more prominent every figure in the chain, the more reliable the chain is. And also hadith scholars, they classified types of transmission. So there isn't like a single type of transmission. One is sema. So the student listening to the teacher reciting from the book, or the student reading the book and the teacher listening to it, or the teacher giving the book without reading and giving the permission to transmit that. So there are like 7 types of it. So you cannot simply buy the book of hadith from the market and transmit it to others. So you have to get authorization, permission from the author itself. Then you can transmit it. So there is one type which is very interesting, i'lam. So the teacher teaches the hadith to the student, but does not give him permission to narrate it to others. So it's called i'lam. So no license, no authority to teach it to others, because the teacher does not trust that you will do a good job when you transmit it to others. All right. And also every narrator was critically analyzed regarding if there is any defect. So the academic competency was analyzed, whether he has like a strong memory, or whether he makes mistakes, or whether he's like uncertain about what he's narrating. So the academic competency was critically analyzed for every narrator. And also the ethical integrity of the hadith narrator was analyzed, like whether he lies outside academic life, let's say in family life, or like with his friends, neighbors. This also counts. And when I made this presentation in America, in Europe, you know, those academics, they get completely shocked. You know, because in modern academia, when you analyze integrity of the scholars, you only look at the academic life. But here, they were looking the family life, you know, outside the academic life. So if a person lied, you know, outside of the academic life, his hadith was rejected, because he's considered to be unreliable, because the person who has no integrity in his personal life may have may do something wrong in his academic life as well. And so this is about how hadith was interpreted. You know, after you get it, I have to go faster. So this is I did some statistical analysis. I used time series analysis from macroeconomics combined it with social network analysis. So these are about the distribution of the number of connections to earlier generations and later generations. So it takes a long time to explain these things, but if you are interested, you know, you can refer to my books and articles on this issue. So I have to skip these things to save time. And so the ties in the transmission network, they are weighted. So let's say a scholar is transmitting a hadith to a scholar, and this scholar has only one student. But then another scholar has many ties. So which tie is more important? Of course, the tie that distributes to more people. So these are part of the critical analysis of it. So let's look at the, in my analysis, I did macro analysis and micro analysis. At the macro analysis, I looked at the connection of generations, as a totality. But at the micro level, I looked at the connections of individual scholars, scholar by scholar, how many connections each scholar had, and how the connections of a particular scholar was distributed to earlier and later generations. So again, explaining these things take a long time, but they show how the connections were distributed to earlier and later generations. So this is very interesting. It's about polyhisters. Polyhister means scholars who are specialized in several disciplines at the same time. Like myself, I'm a sociologist and also Islamic studies, specialist. So I combine. So most of the scholars of hadith, they were also specialized in recitation of the Quran, history, philosophy, and also Sufi, and also they were jurists, because all of them are jurists anyway. That's, I did not include them, but you can see that there are many great philosophers, many great Sufis, many great historians who are at the same time great hadith scholars. So they were multidisciplinary people. And so let's look at a close look at every layer. So this is the layer of the Sahaba. So you see that they were also connected within themselves. So they did not only hear hadith from Prophet Muhammad, but also heard from each other. You see, two Sahabis are very important. They play central, Abu Hurairah and Anas. And so you see that this is the connection of, I chose three narrators from every layer just to illustrate, because it takes long time and effort to illustrate connections of everybody, because I had more than 13,000 connections. So because it is too much, so I just wanted to present how sophisticated the connection. You see that here here you have on the one side generations and their interconnections and connections to earlier generations. So just to give you an idea, so things are getting more intense in the following generations, but I also included the place where they lived and also the history, the dates where their birth and death dates. So you see that early generation only around Medina, but later you have Basra and Kufa. That means network expanding in geography towards Iraq, and then let's say in the 9th layer you have Ibn Rahuya from Nishapur, so Iran. So you see that in the 9th generation it expanded to Iran as well. So that's another example again at the micro level. You see that in layer 13, Tabarani from Isfahan, Daraqutni from Baghdad, and Abu Ali from Nishapur. So the center is moving away from Medina. And he began from layer 11 to layer 18 connections. But here, for instance, you see in layer 15, you have Baji from Cordoba. So network expanded to Spain. And this another illustration of it. So this is the geography in which this network was operating. From India to North Africa to Balkans. And so as I said, my research question was, to explore whether there's a structure, whether there are repeating patterns in every generation. And this graph shows that there are repeating patterns. So this at the micro level, this is the network of how Bukhari was narrated in India, only in India. I mean, you see how complicated, how sophisticated the system is. So this is this is an example of the ijazah, the license. My teacher, Mustafa Al-Azami, he had from Deoband in India. So here, all his teachers reaching to Prophet Muhammad is listed. So the chain of narration, starting from his teacher up to Prophet Muhammad. So this chain is just one of the chains here. As I said, Professor Mustafa Azami, he was my teacher in Hadith, and he came to Istanbul and taught a group of students, and he also gave us diploma, ijazah, tradition ijazah, beginning from him and extending to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are his students who got ijazah from him after training under him. So this is my book, and my friends brought the Arabic translation also. That's the Arabic translation. For those who are interested, they can have a look at it. And so this interconnectedness and unity in Islamic civilization is also reflected in our arts. So I would like to conclude here. I am sorry that I rushed a bit because we have limited time, and I have like another appointment, and I have to leave at 2 to go there. And now it is our Japanese colleague's turn. You can come here.
So, I am Moriyama Teruaki from Dosha University, Kyoto, Japan. So, I'm so honored to be here today. So, my presentation, I will put focus on Hadith scholars. Linked scholarly line originated in the 10th century Khorasan. This Khorasani line of Hadith scholars stretched over various regions from Mawara and Nahr, the Central Asia, to Syria, and involved many scholars who lived between the 10th and 13th centuries. These Hadith scholars called themselves Ashab al-Ahl al-Hadith. The most well-known among them are Al-Hakim al-Naisaburi, Abu Nuaym al-Asbahani, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, and Ibn Asakir al-Dimashqi. These scholars played an important role in both the development of Hadith studies and the spread of Sunnah in the medieval West Asian Muslim society. The goal of this presentation is to examine how these Ashab al-Hadith used Hadiths and their theories regarding the authenticity of Hadith in the society. To reach this goal, I will analyze literature that these scholars compiled to discuss matters not directly related to Hadith studies. This analysis will lead to consideration of how these scholars approached to the society outside of their academic field by using their knowledge of Hadith. This presentation will be divided into 3 sections. The first section will provide a historical outline of these Khorasani Ashab al-Hadith, as well as define their ideological tendencies and academic interests. The second section will analyze how these scholars discussed matters not directly related to Hadith studies. The third section will offer a conclusion. The Arabic term Ashab al-Ahlul Hadith is usually translated as partisans of Hadith. The 20th century's Western scholars such as Joseph Shahat and Wilfred Mardelang have explained that Ashab Hadith was a sect of ulama who argued for a strict observance of the prophetic sunnah transmitted by Hadith. They criticized other ulama who emphasized the usefulness of human reasoning. They called themselves as Ashab al-Hadith, in the contrast to the rationalist ulama known as Ahlul Rai. The contrast between Ashab al-Hadith and Ahlul Rai is stark when viewed in the context of the Abbasid Mihna, which the Caliph Ma'mun initiated in the early 9th century. Ma'mun, a great supporter of the rationalists, oppressed Ashab al-Hadith. However, represented by Ibn Hanbal, Ashab al-Hadith adamantly resisted this opposition, even to the point of being arrested. This reading of history established a concrete but limited narrative in which the Ashab al-Hadith were strict observers of Hadith in the 9th century Iraq, upholding Ibn Hanbal's positions and forbidding any deviation from the prophetic sunnah. These Ashab al-Hadith developed into the Hanbali law school. This is the common understanding of Ashab al-Hadith in the Western and Japanese Islamic studies. However, the pre-modern Muslims' understanding of Ashab al-Hadith seems to be different. It is unusual for Arabic source materials written by pre-modern ulama to describe Ashab al-Hadith as exclusively followers of Ibn Hanbal. For instance, in his Al-Milal wa Nihal, Ash-Shahrastani wrote that Ashab al-Hadith consisted of various groups such as Maliki's followers, Shafi's followers, Ibn Hanbal's followers, and so on. The source materials do not describe these groups as strict adherents to a specific ideology, and thus do not justify labeling them as partisans. The author of the earliest source in which Ashab al-Hadith appears, such as Ibn Sa'd, used the term to mean ulama who specialized in hadith or who knew and transmitted many hadiths. A similar usage of Ashab al-Hadith to mean hadith scholars can also be found in manuscripts written during the Ottoman period. There are many short works with titles such as Mustalahat Ashab al-Hadith. As shown clearly by such titles, these works provided a brief explanation of the terminology used in hadith studies. Little is known about the authors of these works. It is thought that they were mediocrity ulama who wrote these texts as a convenience to hadith studies. Ashab al-Hadith does not refer to a specific group that professed a particular creed, but rather it was an ambiguous denomination given to or used by ulama who had different ideological tendencies. Among them, Shafi Hadith scholars who were also linked to a scholarly line originated in the 10th century Khorasan played an important role in the development of Hadith studies from the late 10th century to the mid-13th century. Al-Hakim al-Naisaburi, who was called Imam Ashab al-Hadith, was one of the most distinguished Khorasani Hadith scholars in the late 10th century and early 11th century. Although some pre-modern ulama and modern scholars have discussed that Mazhab al-Hakim should be categorized under, there is no doubt that he was linked to the line of Shafi Hadith scholars. He said that his teacher, Ibn al-Akhram al-Naisaburi, was Sadr or vanguard of Ashab of Ahlul Hadith in Khorasan. Ibn al-Akhram was a student of Muhammad ibn Nasr al-Marwazi, who was the first scholar to introduce Shafi's doctrine into Khorasan. Another famous teacher of al-Hakim was Abu al-Abbas al-Assam. Al-Assam was a great hadith transmitter in Khorasan and contributed to transmitting Shafi'i's ideology from Shafi'i's direct students to later generations. The scholarly line of Ashab al-Hadith overlapped that of the Shafi'i law school in the 10th century Khorasan, as Christopher Melchett pointed out. In the 11th century, this line spread in Khorasan and Mawara al-Nahr, as well as towards the western regions through teacher-student networks. Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani was one of the most prominent figures involving in spreading this academic line towards the west. As a student of Hakim al-Naisaburi, he was strongly influenced by his Khorasani teacher. One of his students was Khatib al-Baghdadi, the most prominent hadith scholars of the 11th century. After al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, the line continued to spread, leading to the rise of Samani al-Marwazi in the east and even Asakir al-Dimashqi in the west. The ideology of these scholars was based on Shafi doctrine, which posits that the Muslim community should obey the prophetic sunnah contained in the prophetic hadith. Today, some Islamist groups with similar name, such as Ahl Hadith in South Asia, tend to find and criticize many bid'ah in present Muslim society and criticize them. However, Ashab al-Hadith operating around the 11th century did not aggressively criticize the aspects of Muslim society for deviating from Sunnah. Those scholars did not consider that bid'ah infiltrated actual Muslim society. In the contrary, they sought to authorize various matters found in Muslim societies and among governing rulers by using their knowledge of the prophetic hadith in tandem with other traditions attributed to the companions, followers, and former greater Muslims. As a result of their effort, these scholars left many essays on various subjects based on their study of hadith and other traditions. Their essays cover almost everything from al-Bukhala or Mizars to Ilm al-Nujum or astrology. Most of these essays cover their topics positively. The description of the Caliph Ma'mun in Sharh Ashab al-Hadith by Khatib al-Baghdadi is beneficial for understanding the attitude of these Ashab al-Hadith towards the Muslim rulers of their day. The purpose of the essay is to argue for the superiority of Ashab al-Hadith, as the title clearly shows. In this essay, al-Khatib al-Baghdadi stated that Ma'mun was more concerned than any other Abbasid caliph about the transmission of hadith. Furthermore, al-Khatib cited two traditions to demonstrate that Ma'mun respected Ashab al-Hadith enough to participate in the transmission of some hadiths. This description of good relationship between Ma'mun and Ashab al-Hadith clearly contradicts the historical interpretation that Ma'mun oppressed Ashab al-Hadith. This does not mean that Al-Khatib was unaware of a serious contention existing between the rulers and ulama known under the title Ashab al-Hadith. Paradoxically, Khatib's exposition on the good relationship between Ma'mun and Ashab al-Hadith can be viewed as an expression of his discontent regarding the serious contention, as he believed that Ashab al-Hadith and governing rulers should respect and cooperate with each other. The general tendency of these Shafi Khurasani Ashab al-Hadith was to offer positive opinions regarding Muslim society and politics. This tendency shows that their ideology involved an emphasis on social and political stability in Muslim societies. In their literature, they used the Hadith to provide evidence of Islamic legitimacy for matters pertaining to the society. They did not use Hadith as strict criteria for ridding society of bid'ah, but rather as tools for convincing Muslims that they lived in the authentic community obeying the prophetic sunnah. The dominant academic interest of these Ashab al-Hadith was to establish the authenticity of Hadith. Even when these scholars wrote on subjects without direct relationship with Hadith studies, the style and contents of their literature reveals the main academic interest of their pursuit, namely to estimate and demonstrate the authenticity of Hadith. I will consider a description of Isfahan's virtue found in Tarikh Asbahan or Zikr Akhbar Isfahan, or a history of Isfahan by Abu Nuaym, as an example for analyzing the literature of Ashab al-Hadith. The history of Isfahan, which was compiled in the early 11th century, was preceded by a similar book entitled Tabaqat al-Muhaddithin bi Asbahan, or Generations of the Hadith Transmitters in Isfahan, written by Abu Ashayf in the late 10th century. The structure, style, and contents of the Tabaqat are generally like those found in the history of Isfahan. The Tabaqat also includes a description of Isfahan's virtue. However, the style and contents of the description are different from those found in the history of Isfahan. Analyzing these differences allows us to see development of theory to estimate the authenticity of Hadith and methodology to demonstrate it from the late 10th century to early 11th century. At the beginning of the history of Isfahan cites several hadiths relating to a prophetic explanation of a Quranic verse, Surah 62, Ayah 3, وَآخَرِينَ مِنْهُمْ لَمَّا يَلْحَقُوا بِهِمْ, and others yet to join them. These hadiths tells as follows. When God revealed this ayah, the prophet was asked, who are they? The prophet put his hand on Salman Farsi and said, لو كان الإيمان عند الثريا لناله رجال من هؤلاء. Even if the faith is by the Pleiades, men of them get it. As is known well, Salman Farsi, a famous Persian companion, was born and reared in Isfahan. That speech of the prophet with his putting hand on Salman is strong evidence for the Islamic virtue of men of them who should be Persians, in particularly inhabitants of Isfahan. Abu Nuaym discussed the virtue of Isfahan only by citing hadiths and other traditions. He did not urge the virtue from his own words. A few short notes, mainly about ISNAD, which are inserted between hadiths or traditions, are the only words the author himself wrote. in writing about the virtue of Isfahan, Abu Nu'aym depended fully on hadiths and not his own argument or reasoning. His style should be considered worthy of the name Ashab al-Hadith. There is another notable feature of describing virtue, namely the repetition of hadith citations that transmit the same matter with different isnads. Regarding the prophetic explanation of the Quranic verse mentioned above, Abu Nu'aym used 19 hadiths that transmitted almost the same matns with different isnads. On the other hand, Tabaqat al-Muhaddithin, which was compiled about 50 years before the history of Isfahan, also describes the religious virtue of Isfahan by citing tradition and not by the words of the author. However, the work does not repeat the citations of traditions that transmit the same matan with different isnads. Rather, it cites one tradition to describe one subject. Furthermore, Abu Shaykh, the author of the Tabaqat, did not use hadiths attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. He used a tradition to discuss the goodwill of Abraham towards the people of Isfahan. These differences demonstrate that Abu Nu'aym was not influenced by Abu Shaykh regarding his use of hadith for describing the virtue of Isfahan and his style of repeating citations of the same matan with different isnads. The question is from where Abu Nu'aym received this method of using that hadith, as well as using this particular style for describing the virtue of Isfahan. To address the question, it should be noted that such persistent repetition was common in other biographical local history and essays written by Ashab al-Hadith after Abu Nu'aym's generation. This characteristic style has attracted the attention of modern researchers. Some of them have tried to explain the reason why medieval Hadith scholars wrote their books in such a peculiar and monotonous style. Among them, Fred M. Donner offers the possibility that this style was used to demonstrate that a given matan is mutawatir. Although Donner himself did not seem to be satisfied with this assumption, I suppose it can explain the reason for such repetition. Incidentally, the hadiths cited in the description of the Isfahan's virtue are not technically mutawatir. Rather, they are mashhur, since the initial transmitter of almost all those hadiths is a single person, namely Abu Huraira. This style of repetition is attributable to a theory regarding the authenticity of hadith, which Al-Hakim and Naisaburi criticized in his book, Ma'rifatul Ulum al-Hadith. In this book, Al-Hakim defined a concept of mashhur and argued its importance. Since Abu Nu'aym visited Nishapur in his 20s and learned from Al-Hakim, it seems probable that Abu Nu'aym learned Al-Hakim's concept of mashhur and used it to describe Isfahan's virtue. As a result, Abu Nu'aym repeated citations of hadiths that transmit the same matan with different isnads. Moreover, Abu Nu'aym most probably learned from Al-Hakim his method for describing the virtue of Isfahan by citing those hadiths relating the prophetic explanation about Quranic verse, Surah 62, Ayah 3, and praise for Salman al-Farsi. Al-Hakim compiled a biographical local history of Nishapur. The Arabic original of his history of Nishapur has been lost, but it has been reported that Abu Nuaym had a copy of the history of Nishapur. So it is reasonable to suppose that Abu Nuaym referred to Al-Hakim's history of Nishapur when he compiled his history of Isfahan. The same narrative related by the same hadith can be found in the very beginning of both the history of Nishapur and that of Isfahan. In the history of Nishapur, the hadith lacks isnad and the repetition is not found. The Persian translator probably omitted them. Instead of this, the translator noted इमाम हाकिम फरमूदो के इन हदीस दर सहीह इमाम मुज़लिम गोशायरी मज़कूर अस्त. Yani Imam Hakim said that this hadith was related in Sahih by Muslim Kushairi. This translator's note suggests that being included in Sahih Muslim, it was important for Hakim to select the hadith as an evidence for the glories of Khorasan and Nishapur. Abu Nuaym accepted Al-Hakim's selection in the beginning of the history of Isfahan. Abu Nuaym cited a hadith that has a matan perfectly identical to Sahih Muslim. He attached 3 isnad to this matan. One of them is almost the same as the isnad in Sahih Muslim. However, somehow Abu Nuaym did not put the name of Muslim in that isnad. So it is fairly certain that being strongly influenced by Al-Hakim's idea and work, Abu Nuaym repeated citations of hadiths that transmitted the same matan with different isnad in his description of the Isfahan's virtue. Abu Nuaym sometimes used the same style of repetition in his other works. His student Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi adapted this style of repetition. Al-Khatib made the style more sophisticated and used it many essays on various topics, including Sharaf Ashab al-Hadith. The students of Khatib's student, Ibn Asakir, also wrote many essays using this style of repetition. The style was widely used to describe various matters among hadith scholars linked to the line of Khorasani Ashab al-Hadith from the 11th century to the early 30th centuries. Through analysis of this presentation, the following 3 points became clear. The first, the ideology of the Khorasani Shafi Ashab al-Hadith involved an emphasis on social and political stability. They used hadiths to provide evidence of Islamic legitimacy for matters pertaining to the society. Their academic interest was how to estimate and demonstrate the authenticity of hadith. The third, their ideology and academic interest strongly affected the style and contents of their literature regarding matters not directly related to hadith studies. When considering this point, it can be understood that the style of repetition conforms to the ideological tendency and academic interest of Ashab al-Hadith. To convince Muslims that their community obeyed the prophetic sunnah, Ashab al-Hadith required using as many hadiths as possible. Since authenticity was considered important, it could not be disregarded. It had to be demonstrated whenever they used a hadith. The style of repetition based on the concept of mashhur was regarded as a reasonable and convenient method for demonstrating authenticity. This is why that style was widely used among Ashab al-Hadith from the 11th to the early 30th century. However, the spread of this style caused a problem. That was an inflation of authenticity. The more Ashab al-Hadith conveniently demonstrated the authenticity of various hadiths, the more they faced a devaluation of authentic hadith. This dilemma seems to have been already noted in the 11th century. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi warned that the authenticity should not easily depend on the concept of mashhur, though he wrote a lot of essays in the style of repetition. Perhaps this dilemma is one of the reasons why the style of repetition became less utilized in the 13th century. It is clear from this presentation that when using a hadith, the Khurasani Shafi Ashab al-Hadith were not particularly concerned if a given hadith accurately transmitted what the Prophet Muhammad truly said or did. They sought to stage authenticity for effect to convince their readers and audience. One aspect of their scholarly practice entitles an effort to utilize various hadiths to legitimizing existing Muslim society by basing various social matters on Sunnah. These hadiths were authorized by their theory and methodology of hadith studies to demonstrate the authenticity. This effort to use the hadith as a tool for stabilizing Muslims' social value contributed to the spread of Sunnah throughout society. From the 10th century, 30th centuries, the rational and pragmatic scholarly practice of the Khurasani Shafi Ashab al-Hadith stimulated formation of a community that imagined it was obeying the prophetic Sunnah. Thank you for your attention.